Princess Elena had never asked for the crown. From the moment she was born, however, everyone in the kingdom knew that one day it would belong to her. She was the only daughter of the late king, and according to the ancient laws of the royal family, she was the rightful heir to the throne. Her childhood was spent inside the palace, surrounded by tutors, royal advisors, guards, and servants who constantly reminded her that being a princess was not simply a privilege. It was a responsibility. Unlike many members of the royal family, Elena was known for treating ordinary people with kindness. She would often leave the grand halls of the palace and visit the gardens, the village markets, and the homes of families who had suffered during difficult seasons. She listened to their problems and remembered their names. The people admired her because she never behaved as though the crown made her better than anyone else. But inside the palace, not everyone admired her. Her uncle, Lord Adrian, had always believed that the throne should have belonged to him. He had served Elena's father for many years and considered himself more experienced, more powerful, and more deserving of the crown. When the king was alive, he had hidden his jealousy behind loyalty. He smiled during royal ceremonies, praised Elena in public, and promised the king that he would protect his daughter. After the king's death, however, his true ambitions slowly began to appear. Adrian began convincing members of the royal council that Elena was too young and too inexperienced to rule. He whispered that the kingdom needed a stronger leader. He reminded people of every small mistake she had ever made and exaggerated them until they sounded like serious failures. Some nobles believed him, while others remained silent because they were afraid of challenging someone with so much influence. Elena noticed the change. The palace that had once felt like her home began to feel strangely cold. Conversations stopped whenever she entered a room. Servants who had once smiled at her suddenly avoided eye contact. Even some of the royal advisors began treating her with unnecessary suspicion. Still, Elena refused to fight her family with anger. She continued preparing for her coronation. Every morning, she studied reports about the kingdom. In the afternoons, she met with advisors and learned about trade, agriculture, military affairs, and the laws of the crown. At night, she often stood alone beside her father's old portrait, wondering whether she would ever be able to become the ruler he had hoped she would become. The coronation was only days away when the most important symbol of the kingdom was brought into the royal treasury: the crown. It was an ancient piece of gold decorated with small precious stones and a single blue sapphire in the center. Every monarch of the royal family had worn it for generations. To the kingdom, it represented more than wealth. It represented the continuation of the royal bloodline and the responsibility carried by whoever wore it. Elena had seen the crown many times, but she never treated it like an object of personal glory. She understood what it represented. The night before the final coronation preparations, Elena was informed that the crown had been placed inside the most secure chamber of the palace. Guards were stationed outside the treasury. The doors were locked. The keys were held by trusted members of the royal household. Everything appeared secure. But somewhere inside the palace, someone was already planning to take it. Adrian had waited years for this opportunity. He knew that without the crown, the coronation could not proceed normally. If Elena appeared before the kingdom without it, rumors would spread. If he could make it appear that she had lost or stolen the crown herself, her reputation could collapse before she ever sat on the throne. He carefully chose people who were loyal to him. No one was told the entire plan. One servant was instructed to distract a guard. Another was told to deliver a false message. A palace official was persuaded to unlock a corridor at a specific hour. Each person believed they were performing a small and harmless task. None of them understood how far the plan would go. Just after midnight, the palace became unusually quiet. The guards outside the treasury changed shifts. A servant carrying a silver tray walked through the eastern corridor. A royal official appeared near the treasury with a document bearing the royal seal. And for only a few minutes, the security around the crown was weakened. Those few minutes were enough. The treasury door opened. A shadow entered the room. The crown disappeared. By sunrise, Elena's life had changed completely. The palace was preparing for the greatest ceremony of her life. But the most important object in the kingdom was gone. And the people who had taken it were already preparing to make sure everyone blamed the princess. By the time the sun rose over the royal palace, the entire household was already moving with unusual urgency. Servants hurried through the corridors, guards whispered to one another, and senior officials repeatedly entered and left the royal council chamber. Something was wrong, and although nobody wanted to say it openly, the fear on their faces made it obvious that the palace was facing a serious crisis. Princess Elena was still unaware of what had happened. She had spent the previous evening preparing for her coronation. Her ceremonial dress had been arranged, her advisors had reviewed the final schedule, and the royal chapel had been decorated for the ceremony. She had gone to sleep believing that the following day would mark the beginning of her reign. Instead, just before breakfast, 3 guards entered her private sitting room. Their expressions were tense. One of them lowered his head and said that the royal crown was missing. Elena stared at him in disbelief. Missing. The guard nodded. The treasury was opened during the night, Your Highness. The crown is gone. For several seconds, Elena could not respond. She knew exactly what the crown represented. Without it, the coronation could not proceed as planned. But even more disturbing was the fact that the royal treasury was one of the most heavily protected places in the entire palace. Someone had deliberately taken it. Elena immediately asked who had access to the treasury. The guards listed several names: royal officials, senior servants, treasury officers, and members of the royal family. The moment Elena heard that last category, she felt a strange chill. She asked the guards to take her to the treasury. When she entered the chamber, she saw the empty velvet cushion where the crown had been placed. The golden outline of the crown's shape was still visible against the dark fabric. Nothing else appeared to be missing. That made the situation even more suspicious. Whoever had taken the crown had not been interested in stealing royal treasures. They had wanted one specific object: the crown. Elena walked slowly around the chamber, studying the room. The locks showed no obvious signs of damage. The windows were still secured. The guards insisted that nobody unfamiliar had entered the palace during the night. Someone had used knowledge of the palace to carry out the theft. Then the royal council arrived. Lord Adrian entered first. He looked concerned, but there was something about his expression that Elena could not understand. His eyes moved toward the empty crown stand before returning to her face. He immediately asked whether Elena had entered the treasury during the previous night. The question shocked her. No, she answered. Adrian remained silent for a moment. Then another council member spoke. The crown was supposed to be under the princess's protection. Elena turned toward him. I was never given possession of the crown. But you were the future queen, the official replied. Surely you understood how important it was. Elena could feel the room turning against her. The questions continued. Where had she been? Who had she spoken to? Had anyone visited her? Had she ordered a servant to enter the treasury? Did she know where the crown was? Each question sounded less like an investigation and more like an accusation. Elena tried to remain calm. She demanded that the guards investigate every person who had entered the treasury corridor. But before the investigation could properly begin, Adrian produced something that changed the entire situation. A small piece of fabric. It had been found near the treasury door. It appeared to match the material used in Elena's ceremonial clothing. Adrian held it carefully between his fingers. This was found near the treasury, he said. Elena looked at it closely. She immediately recognized the color, but she also knew something was wrong. The fabric did resemble the material used for her coronation dress. However, her dress had never been taken out of the royal wardrobe. She explained this to the council. Adrian responded calmly. Perhaps another piece of your clothing was used. The accusation was becoming more direct. The council members began whispering among themselves. Elena demanded that her wardrobe be inspected. When the royal attendants examined her clothing, they found nothing missing. But that did not matter anymore. The rumor had already begun spreading through the palace. The princess had taken the crown. The princess wanted to secure her position. The princess had arranged the theft. By midday, the story had reached the servants' quarters. By afternoon, it had reached the city. People gathered outside the palace gates, wondering why the coronation had been delayed. Elena stood behind a tall palace window and watched the crowd. For the first time in her life, she saw uncertainty in the eyes of people who had once trusted her. She wanted to go outside and tell them the truth, but the council ordered her to remain inside the palace until the investigation was complete. Then another accusation appeared. A treasury record showed that someone had used Elena's royal identification seal to authorize access to a restricted corridor on the night of the theft. Elena immediately denied doing so. "I never gave permission for anyone to enter that corridor." But the record appeared official. The seal appeared genuine, and the evidence seemed to be building against her. What Elena did not know was that every detail had been carefully prepared. The fabric had been planted. The record had been altered. The rumors had been spread before the theft was even discovered. Adrian had not simply stolen the crown. He had designed the entire situation so that the princess would appear responsible. Later that evening, Elena was summoned before the full royal council. The enormous chamber was filled with nobles, advisors, guards, and senior members of the royal household. At the center of the room stood an empty pedestal, the place where the crown should have been. Adrian stepped forward and spoke in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Until the crown is found, the coronation cannot continue." Elena looked around the chamber. People who had once bowed before her now looked at her with suspicion. The future she had spent years preparing for was suddenly being placed in danger. And somewhere within the palace, the stolen crown remained hidden, waiting for the next part of the plan to begin. The royal council chamber had never felt so cold to Princess Elena. She stood alone in the center of the enormous room, while dozens of members of the royal court watched her from their seats. The walls were covered with portraits of former kings and queens, people who had ruled the kingdom for generations. Above them hung the royal banners, but that day they seemed less like symbols of pride and more like reminders of everything Elena was about to lose. At the far end of the chamber, Lord Adrian stood beside the council table. He appeared calm. Too calm. Elena looked at him carefully, trying to understand how the man who had once promised her father that he would protect her could now stand silently while the entire court questioned her loyalty. The chief royal advisor placed several documents on the table. "The evidence is troubling," he said. Elena stepped forward. "Evidence of what?" The advisor hesitated. "Evidence that you may have been involved in the disappearance of the crown." A wave of whispers moved through the chamber. Elena looked around in disbelief. "I have already told you. I did not take the crown." One of the nobles stood. "But the treasury was accessed using authorization connected to your royal seal." "I did not authorize anyone." "Then who did?" "I don't know." The noble shook his head. "That is convenient." Elena felt anger rising inside her, but she refused to lose control. She had been taught by her father that a future queen must remain calm when everyone around her is afraid. So she took a breath and asked for the evidence to be examined properly. She requested the treasury guards be questioned individually. She requested that the palace records be checked. She requested that every person who had entered the eastern corridor that night be investigated. But instead of agreeing, the council seemed increasingly determined to focus on her. Then Lord Adrian finally spoke. "Perhaps we should ask the princess why she would want the crown." Elena turned toward him. "Why would I steal the crown that I am supposed to receive at my own coronation?" Adrian's expression remained neutral. "Perhaps because you feared the council might delay your coronation." The room became silent. Elena stared at him. "You believe I would steal my own crown because I was afraid of losing it?" Adrian did not answer immediately. He simply looked at the council members. That silence was enough. Several nobles began exchanging uncertain glances. Elena realized what was happening. Someone was not trying to prove that she had stolen the crown. They were trying to make people believe that she was capable of doing it. The difference was enormous. The stolen crown itself had disappeared, but suspicion had become the real weapon. Later that afternoon, Elena was escorted back to her private quarters. 2 guards were placed outside her door. She was no longer treated as the future queen. She was being treated as a suspect. Her personal attendants were questioned. Her letters were inspected. Her belongings were searched. Even the servants who had worked for her family for years were asked whether Elena had ever spoken about taking the crown before her coronation. Everywhere she turned, she found another wall of distrust. Her closest maid, Clara, entered the room that evening with tears in her eyes. "They searched everything?" Clara whispered. Elena looked at her. "Did they find anything?" Clara shook her head. "No." Elena sat beside the window. Outside, the palace gardens were quiet. She could see the fountain where she had played as a child. She could see the stone path where her father used to walk with her. She could see the balcony from which the king had once addressed thousands of people. Everything looked exactly the same, yet nothing felt the same anymore. Clara sat beside her. "Your Highness, people believe the rumors because they are afraid." Elena looked down. "I thought they knew me." "They do," Clara said softly. "But fear makes people forget what they know." Those words stayed with Elena. The following morning, another announcement was made. The coronation would be postponed indefinitely. The official reason was the missing crown, but everyone in the palace understood the deeper meaning. The council no longer trusted Elena enough to place the kingdom in her hands. Lord Adrian had achieved the first part of his plan. The princess had been separated from the throne without a single sword being drawn. But he wanted more. He wanted the kingdom to believe that Elena was unfit to rule. A meeting was called with several powerful nobles. Adrian told them that the kingdom could not remain without a confirmed ruler. He suggested that temporary leadership should be placed in the hands of a senior member of the royal family. The nobles knew exactly who he meant. Adrian. Some resisted the idea. Others supported him. He reminded them that he had served the late king for years. He reminded them that he understood military affairs. He reminded them that he had experience managing the kingdom. He never openly said that he wanted the throne. He simply allowed everyone else to say it for him. Meanwhile, Elena remained isolated inside the palace. She received no official explanation. She was not allowed to attend council meetings. She was instructed not to leave the palace grounds. Even the royal guards who had once protected her now followed orders from the council rather than from her. One evening, Elena heard footsteps outside her chamber. The door opened. Lord Adrian entered. For the first time since the crown disappeared, they were completely alone. Elena looked directly at him. "Did you do this?" Adrian paused. "Do what?" "Steal the crown." He smiled faintly. "You have always been intelligent." "That is not an answer." Adrian walked slowly toward the window. "The kingdom needs stability, Elena." "It needs the truth." "The truth," he replied, "is whatever the people believe." Elena's expression hardened. "You are afraid of me." Adrian turned toward her. "I am not afraid of you." "Then why are you trying so hard to destroy me?" For a moment, Adrian said nothing. Then he stepped closer. "Because some people are born into power," he said quietly, "while others spend their entire lives watching them receive it." Elena understood. This had never been about the crown alone. It had been about jealousy. It had been about ambition. And it had been growing inside the palace for years. Adrian left the room without another word. Elena remained by the window, thinking about everything that had happened. The stolen crown. The false evidence. The altered records. The accusations. The postponed coronation. Someone had planned all of it, and whoever had created the plan had made one serious mistake. The first strange incident happened shortly after midnight. The palace had finally become quiet after another exhausting day of accusations and arguments. Most of the servants had gone to their quarters, the royal council had retired, and the guards had taken their positions throughout the corridors. But the palace did not feel peaceful. It felt watchful. A young guard named Thomas was walking through the eastern corridor when he heard footsteps behind him. He stopped. The footsteps stopped too. He turned around. The corridor was empty. Only the tall windows, dark portraits, and flickering wall lamps surrounded him. Thomas continued walking. After several steps, he heard the footsteps again. This time they were closer. He turned quickly, nothing. He raised his lantern and looked down the corridor. At the far end stood an old portrait of Queen Eleanor, one of the earliest rulers of the kingdom. Thomas had passed that portrait hundreds of times, but something about it suddenly caught his attention. The queen's eyes appeared to be looking directly at him. Thomas stepped closer. Then the lantern flame suddenly went out. He froze. A cold breeze moved through the corridor even though every window was closed. Then he heard a woman's voice. "Where is the crown?" Thomas dropped the lantern. He ran. By morning, he was found outside the guards' quarters, pale and shaking. When the captain asked what had happened, Thomas refused to explain at first. Eventually, he whispered that someone had spoken to him from the darkness. The captain dismissed it as exhaustion. But Thomas was not the only person who had heard something that night. A palace maid named Clara woke suddenly in her room after hearing a loud metallic sound coming from the direction of the royal treasury. She left her bed and opened her door. The corridor was empty. Then she noticed something strange. A trail of wet footprints crossed the stone floor. They began near the treasury corridor. They continued toward the old royal wing, and then they simply stopped. Clara followed them until she reached an enormous wooden door that had been sealed for decades. Nobody was supposed to enter that part of the palace. The door was locked, but as Clara approached, she heard a faint scratching sound from the other side. She stepped backward. The scratching stopped. Then something knocked from inside. 3 slow knocks. Clara ran back to the servants' quarters. By sunrise, rumors had begun spreading. Some servants believed the palace was haunted. Others believed someone was secretly moving through the corridors. But the royal council refused to discuss the incidents. Lord Adrian insisted that the servants were frightened because of the stolen crown. He ordered the guards to increase patrols. He also ordered everyone to stop spreading rumors. But the strange events continued. 2 nights later, a nobleman who had publicly accused Elena of stealing the crown was walking toward his private chamber when he heard someone whisper his name. He turned. Nobody was there. He continued walking. Again, he heard his name. This time the voice sounded closer. He entered his room and locked the door. When he turned around, he saw something lying on his desk. A small piece of blue fabric, the same color as the ribbon that had been attached to the stolen crown. The nobleman immediately called for the guards. When they arrived, the fabric was gone. Only a strange sentence had appeared on the paper beside his desk. "Return what does not belong to you." The guards searched the room. They found nothing. The nobleman refused to sleep there that night. Soon, similar incidents began happening to others who had supported Adrian. One servant found the treasury door open, even though he had personally watched the guards lock it. Another heard crying coming from an empty hallway. A royal official woke up to find every candle in his room burning despite having gone to sleep in darkness. Then something even more disturbing happened. The palace clock stopped. It happened at exactly midnight. Every clock inside the palace stopped at the same moment. The guards checked them. The servants checked them. Even the large clock in the central hall had stopped. The hands were frozen at 12. Then, after several minutes, the clock began moving again. But instead of continuing forward, the hands moved backward. The palace became terrified. Nobody could explain it. Elena heard the commotion from her room. She opened her door and saw servants running through the corridor. A guard tried to stop her from leaving. "The council ordered you to remain inside." Elena ignored him. "What happened?" The guard hesitated. "The clock stopped. All of them." He nodded. Elena walked toward the central hall. When she arrived, she saw dozens of people gathered beneath the enormous clock. The royal advisors were arguing. The servants were whispering. Lord Adrian stood in the center of the room, staring at the clock. Then Elena noticed something. The clock was not simply broken. A thin line had appeared across the glass. And behind the glass, the hands were pointing toward a symbol engraved into the clock's face. It was the same symbol that appeared on the royal crown. Elena moved closer. Nobody spoke. For several seconds, she simply stared at it. Then she remembered something her father had told her when she was a child. He had once shown her an ancient royal book and explained that the crown was connected to the history of the palace in ways that ordinary people did not understand. At the time, Elena had thought it was simply an old family story. Now she wondered if it had been a warning. That same night, another disturbance occurred. A group of guards were ordered to search the abandoned western wing. They entered carrying lanterns and swords. The hallway had been unused for years. Dust covered the floors. Old furniture stood beneath white sheets. The guards searched room after room. Then they reached an old chamber that had once belonged to a former queen. The door opened by itself. The guards froze. Inside the room stood a large wooden table. On the table was a single object, a golden crown-shaped ornament. One of the guards stepped toward it. Then the door slammed shut behind them. They tried to open it. It would not move. The lantern flames began flickering. A cold wind swept through the room, and from somewhere inside the darkness came the sound of a woman's voice. "Thieves." The guards began pounding on the door. Outside, other soldiers heard their screams and rushed toward them. When they finally forced the door open, the room was empty. The guards were still inside. The ornament was gone, but written across the dusty table were several words. "The palace remembers." By the next morning, fear had spread through every corner of the royal residence. The people who had stolen the crown began turning against one another. Each person wondered who had planted the strange messages. Each suspected that another had betrayed the group. Adrian tried to maintain control, but even he began looking over his shoulder whenever he walked through the palace corridors. The stolen crown was still missing. Elena was still being blamed. Yet the palace itself seemed to be sending a message that nobody could ignore. Something had changed inside those ancient walls, and whatever had begun after the crown disappeared was becoming impossible for the royal family to control. Why had assumed Elena would simply accept defeat? The following morning, the palace was surrounded by an unusual silence. Nobody spoke loudly in the corridors anymore. Servants moved quickly with their eyes lowered, guards avoided unnecessary conversations, and even the members of the royal council seemed uncomfortable remaining inside the ancient building for too long. The strange events of the previous nights had changed everything. For days, everyone had believed that the stolen crown was simply a valuable royal object. Now, people were beginning to wonder whether it had been connected to something much older. Princess Elena could not stop thinking about the symbol she had seen on the palace clock. She had seen that symbol before. Years earlier, when her father was still king, he had taken her into a private library that very few people were allowed to enter. The room contained hundreds of ancient books, royal records, maps, letters, and documents passed down through generations. Her father had shown her an old manuscript. He had told her that some royal traditions were not written in ordinary history books. "There are things about this palace," he had said, "that every ruler must understand before wearing the crown." At the time, Elena had laughed and asked whether he was trying to frighten her. Her father had smiled. Perhaps. But he had never explained what he meant. Now Elena needed to know. She asked Clara to help her search the old royal library. Because Elena was still under suspicion, she was not officially allowed to leave her quarters without permission. Clara secretly obtained a key from an old servant who had remained loyal to the princess. They entered the library after midnight. The room was enormous. Tall shelves reached almost to the ceiling, and hundreds of dusty books filled the walls. A large wooden table stood beneath a stained glass window. The moonlight coming through the glass created strange patterns across the floor. Elena remembered exactly where her father had kept the old manuscript. She walked toward a shelf in the far corner. There were dozens of books there. She searched carefully. Nothing. Then she noticed a small wooden compartment hidden behind several books. She pulled one of the books forward. A section of the shelf moved. Behind it was a narrow space. Inside was a leather-bound book. Elena's hands trembled as she picked it up. The cover had no title. Only the royal symbol was engraved into the leather. She opened the first page. The handwriting was extremely old. The first sentence immediately caught her attention. "The crown does not belong to the strongest ruler. It belongs to the rightful heir," Elena continued reading. The manuscript described the history of the royal crown. According to the ancient records, the crown had been created centuries earlier, after the founding of the kingdom. It was not simply a symbol of monarchy. It had been designed to represent the agreement between the royal family and the people. The crown could be worn only by the person recognized as the rightful heir. But there was another part of the story. The crown had been kept inside the palace for generations because the palace itself had been built around an ancient royal sanctuary. The sanctuary was believed to protect the kingdom from those who attempted to take the throne through betrayal. Elena read the passage twice. She looked at Clara. "Do you believe this?" Clara looked frightened. "I don't know what to believe anymore." Elena continued reading. The manuscript explained that when the crown was taken from its rightful heir through deception, the palace would respond, not with soldiers, not with weapons, but through signs. Doors that should remain locked might open. Clocks could stop. Hidden passages might reveal themselves. Old symbols could appear. And those responsible for the betrayal would begin seeing warnings. The purpose was not to punish innocent people. It was to expose the truth. Elena felt a chill move through her. Everything that had happened suddenly seemed connected. The strange footsteps, the locked doors, the stopped clocks, the messages, the symbol. The palace was not randomly behaving strangely. Someone had disturbed something that had remained undisturbed for generations. Elena turned another page. There was a drawing of the royal crown. Beneath it was a detailed illustration of the palace. Several hidden areas were marked in red. One of them was directly beneath the throne room. Another was beneath the old western wing. A third was marked beneath the royal treasury. Elena stared at the map. "The treasury," she whispered. Clara leaned closer. What is beneath it? I don't know. They searched the manuscript for an explanation. Eventually, they found another passage. It described a hidden chamber called the Chamber of the First Crown. According to the records, the chamber had been created when the original royal crown was placed inside the palace centuries ago. Only the rightful heir was supposed to enter it. The entrance had been sealed after the death of the first queen. Elena's heart began beating faster. If the chamber is still there, she said, then someone may have hidden the crown there. Clara looked nervous. But who? Elena thought about Adrian. He had access to the palace. He understood its hidden corridors. He knew the royal traditions. And most importantly, he had a reason to prevent Elena from becoming queen. She closed the manuscript. We need to find the chamber. They returned to the treasury corridor before dawn. The guards were changing shifts, giving Elena and Clara only a short opportunity. They waited until the corridor was empty. Then Elena examined the walls surrounding the treasury. Nothing appeared unusual. She touched the stone blocks one by one. Most were cold and solid. Then her fingers touched a carved symbol. The same symbol from the crown. She pressed it. Nothing happened. She pressed harder. A faint clicking sound came from inside the wall. Clara stepped backward. A narrow section of stone moved. Behind it was a dark passage. Cold air flowed from the opening. Elena raised a lantern. The passage descended beneath the palace. The walls were covered with ancient carvings. Some showed former kings. Others showed queens standing beside the crown. But one carving caught Elena's attention. It showed a princess standing alone before the throne. Behind her were several people reaching for the crown. Above the scene was the same royal symbol. Elena touched the carving. She suddenly understood something. The story in the manuscript was not merely a legend. Someone had faced betrayal before. Someone had tried to steal the crown from a rightful heir. And the palace had remembered. Elena and Clara continued down the passage. After several minutes, they reached a large stone door. There was no handle. No lock, only a single circular symbol in the center. Elena placed her hand against it. The stone remained still for several seconds. Then something happened. The symbol began to glow faintly. A deep mechanical sound echoed through the passage. The door slowly began moving. Behind it was a chamber that had not been opened for generations. At the center stood an empty stone pedestal. But around the pedestal were dozens of ancient inscriptions. Elena walked closer. One inscription was written in a language she did not understand. Another was written in the old royal language. She recognized one word. Heir? Then Clara pointed toward the floor. There were fresh footprints in the dust. Someone had been inside the chamber recently. Elena's heart sank. They were not the first people to discover the hidden room. Someone else already knew about it. Someone had been searching for the same secret. And suddenly, from somewhere deeper inside the chamber, they heard a faint metallic sound. Clara gripped Elena's arm. They both turned toward the darkness. The sound came again. Slow, heavy, like something made of metal being dragged across stone. Elena raised the lantern. The light revealed another passage leading deeper beneath the palace. And at the entrance of that passage, carved into the wall, was a message that had clearly been written much more recently than the ancient inscriptions. The crown is closer than you think? Elena stood at the entrance of the hidden passage for several moments, staring at the words carved into the stone. The crown is closer than you think. The message changed everything. Until that moment, Elena had believed that finding the hidden chamber would answer the mystery. Instead, it raised even more questions. Someone had entered the chamber before her. Someone knew about the ancient passage. Someone had left a message specifically for whoever discovered the secret. And there was only one person inside the palace who seemed to know enough about the old royal traditions to understand what the crown truly represented. Lord Adrian. Elena turned toward Clara. We cannot tell anyone yet. Clara looked surprised. Not even the guards. Especially not the guards. They returned through the hidden passage before anyone noticed their absence. Elena carefully closed the secret entrance and returned to her chambers. For the first time since the crown had disappeared, she did not feel completely powerless. She now had something Adrian did not know she possessed. The truth? But Elena understood that simply accusing Adrian would not be enough. He had already created false evidence against her. If she confronted him without proof, he could easily turn the accusation